The night Frank Lucas walked into Dean Martin's world, he did not look like a king, and that was exactly the point. The casino lounge on the edge of Las Vegas pulsed with a low, velvety confidence. The kind money created when it had nowhere left to prove itself. Cigarette smoke drifted like a second ceiling, thick enough to blur chandeliers into soft halos. While men in tailored suits leaned back in leather chairs, speaking quietly but listening hard. This was a room where power did not raise its voice, because it did not need to. Frank entered without an entourage, without flash, without apology. Carrying nothing but a simple leather bag in his right hand and the weight of a decision he had not yet fully committed to. He had crossed many rooms like this before, rooms where men watched first and judged later, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was not here to negotiate territory or send a message through fear. Tonight, he was here to test something rarer, whether respect could be bought. Not with force, but with restraint. Dean Martin was already on stage when Frank arrived, standing beneath a wash of warm amber light that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if everyone present had been personally invited into a private confession. Dean's voice carried that familiar smoothness, effortless, yet precise. A sound that suggested ease, while hiding the discipline beneath it. He sang not to impress, but to connect, letting the notes land softly, trusting they would stay. Frank did not sit immediately. He stood near the back, observing the room as he always did, noting how the most dangerous men smiled when Dean hit a certain phrase, how their shoulders loosened, how their guard slipped just enough to reveal who they really were when they thought no one was counting. Frank had learned long ago that power showed itself most clearly in moments of comfort. Anyone could be intimidating. Very few could make hardened men feel safe. When the song ended, applause rolled forward like a controlled wave, measured, respectful, never excessive. Dean nodded once, a modest acknowledgement, then stepped off stage with the same calm he had brought to it. The men nearest the wings leaned in, murmuring approval, but Dean did not linger. He moved with quiet purpose, toward the back lounge, where deals were not discussed openly, but understood through glances and timing. Frank followed at a distance, letting the crowd thin, letting the moment choose him instead of forcing it. He had learned from mentors long gone that the fastest way to lose leverage was to announce your intentions before the room was ready to hear them. The back lounge was smaller, darker, designed for conversations that did not want witnesses. Two men at the door glanced at Frank, eyes narrowing slightly, not hostile, just alert. Frank met their gaze without challenge, without submission, and one of them nodded, stepping aside. Inside, Dean Martin sat at a small table with a drink untouched in front of him, his jacket unbuttoned, posture relaxed, eyes sharper than most people realized. Dean looked up as Frank entered, not surprised, not impressed, just curious. That curiosity, Frank knew, was the most valuable currency in the room. They did not shake hands immediately. They studied each other first, measuring presence, intent, the invisible signals men like them spoke fluently without words. Dean was used to powerful men approaching him with favors to ask or legends to borrow. Frank was used to men mistaking silence for weakness. Tonight, neither made that mistake. Frank placed the leather bag gently on the table between them, not opening it, not explaining it. The sound it made when it touched the wood was soft, deliberate, final. Dean glanced at it briefly, then back at Frank's face. "You're early," Dean said, voice low, conversational, as if they were old acquaintances continuing a discussion rather than strangers beginning one. "I like to arrive before expectations do," Frank replied, choosing his words carefully. He sat without being invited, not as an act of disrespect, but as a signal of equality. He did not lean forward. He did not lean back. He waited. Dean smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had disarmed crowds for decades without ever giving itself away. "Most men who bring bags don't wait," he said. "They're eager to show what's inside." Frank nodded once. Most men need what's inside to speak for them. That was the moment the room shifted, subtle but real. Dean did not look away. He did not reach for the bag. He studied Frank more closely now, seeing not just ambition, but calculation tempered by something rare: discipline. Frank could feel the weight of unseen eyes beyond the walls, men who controlled money, unions, reputations, men who decided who was allowed to remain standing after the music stopped. He knew that if he opened the bag now, the story would become smaller. It would turn into numbers, transactions, assumptions, so he left it closed. "I didn't come here to buy your name," Frank said finally. "I came to return something." Dean raised an eyebrow, amused. "Most returns come with a receipt." Frank reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, not for another envelope, but for a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. He placed it beside the bag. "Years ago," he said, "you walked away from a room where everyone expected you to stay quiet. You didn't make a speech. You didn't humiliate anyone. You just left. That night saved more than one man who didn't deserve saving, including me." Dean looked at the paper, but did not touch it. His expression softened, not with sentimentality, but with recognition. He remembered that night. He remembered choosing dignity over dominance, knowing it would cost him in whispers and rumors, knowing restraint often looked like weakness to people who had never needed to be strong. He also remembered the faces in that room, the ones who had learned something, and the ones who had learned nothing at all, in the bag. Dean asked. Frank finally opened it, just enough for Dean to see neatly stacked bundles. Crisp, precise, untouched by desperation. 100,000, Frank said, not loudly, not proudly. Not a bribe, not a favor, a boundary. "I want nothing from you except permission to leave this here." Dean laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You know how many men would beg for that permission?" "I know," Frank replied. "That's why I didn't ask." Dean studied the money again, then pushed the bag back toward Frank with one finger. "If you leave it," he said, "it stops being about money. It becomes about what you think it buys." Frank closed the bag without argument. "Then let it buy nothing," he said. "Let it stand as proof that not every gesture comes with strings. Some come with memory." Silence filled the space between them, heavy but not hostile. Outside, laughter rose. Glasses clinked. The night carried on, unaware of the quiet negotiation happening in the shadows. Dean leaned back, finally lifting his drink, taking a small sip. "You know," he said, "the men watching this room tonight, they'll never hear what was said here. But they'll feel it tomorrow." Frank nodded. "That's all I wanted." Dean stood, signaling the end without dismissing him. "Leave the bag," he said at last. "Not for me. For the room. Let it wonder." Frank did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and left the bag where it was. As he walked out, the men near the door straightened, something unspoken passing between them. Word would travel, not in details, but in tone. Frank Lucas had entered quietly, offered without demand, and walked away without loss. In a world built on force, that kind of restraint unsettled everyone. Outside, the neon lights burned just as brightly as before, but Frank felt the shift inside him. He had not conquered anything tonight. He had not claimed territory, but he had planted something far more dangerous: a standard. And in rooms like these, standards were the only thing even kings feared. By the following afternoon, the city had already begun to reinterpret what had happened the night before. Not through facts, but through instinct, the way powerful ecosystems always do. Las Vegas did not traffic in truth so much as implication, and implication had a way of growing teeth. Men who had been in the casino lounge spoke carefully over breakfast, lowering their voices not because they were afraid of being overheard, but because the subject itself demanded respect. Frank Lucas's name surfaced without context, without embellishment, usually followed by a pause that said more than any explanation could. The pause was the important part. It meant people were thinking. It meant they were recalculating. And in a world where status depended on knowing exactly where everyone else stood, recalculation was dangerous. Frank spent that day moving slowly, deliberately resisting the instinct to capitalize on momentum. Years earlier, he would have pushed immediately, leveraged curiosity into advantage, let uncertainty work for him before it settled. But the man he had become understood something his younger self never had. Momentum was loud, but gravity was patient. He stayed out of sight, letting others do the talking for him, letting their imaginations inflate the story into something larger than reality. Somewhere in those rumors, Frank knew. His restraint would become myth, and myth, once born, required no further maintenance. Across town, Dean Martin woke later than usual, not because he was tired, but because the night had followed him into sleep. He had seen many gestures in his life, most of them transactional, some flattering, many insulting in their assumptions. What Frank had done was neither subtle nor aggressive. It was intentional, and intention was what lingered. Dean sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment before standing, replaying the scene not with suspicion, but with curiosity. He had recognized something in Frank Lucas that night. Something disciplined and dangerous, not because it sought power, but because it did not seem desperate for it. Dean understood men like that. They were the ones who survived when others burned too brightly. Later that afternoon, Dean arrived at a private club off the Strip, a place where access mattered more than money and reputation was checked at the door like a coat. The room filled gradually with men who had influence, but preferred not to be seen using it openly. They greeted Dean warmly, genuinely, but beneath the cordiality lay a shared awareness that something had shifted. One by one, conversations circled toward the same subject without ever naming it directly. Dean listened more than he spoke, a habit that had protected him for decades. When someone finally asked lightly whether the rumors were true, Dean did not deny them. He did not confirm them either. He simply smiled and said, "Some men understand the difference between arrival and announcement." That was all it took. The room absorbed the message like dry ground absorbs rain. That evening, Frank Lucas received a message through an intermediary he trusted, not an invitation, not a summons. Just a suggestion that his presence would not be unwelcome at a gathering scheduled for later that week. Frank read the note twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. He understood the language well enough. This was not about reward. It was about observation. The men behind the invitation wanted to see if the restraint he had shown was situational or structural. Frank smiled faintly at the thought. He had built his entire life around structure. Restraint was not an act. It was an operating system. The night of the gathering arrived quietly, without spectacle, and Frank chose his appearance with the same care he chose his words. Nothing ostentatious, nothing forgettable. He arrived alone again, the absence of an entourage now unmistakably intentional. As he entered, conversations paused just a fraction of a second longer than normal, the kind of pause that acknowledged presence without conceding power. Frank noticed it and moved on, greeting no one, allowing the room to decide how it wanted to see him. This was not arrogance. It was confidence tempered by patience. Dean arrived later, his entrance effortless, greeted with warmth that bordered on reverence. He scanned the room and found Frank standing near the bar, untouched drink in hand, posture relaxed but alert. For a moment, Dean considered leaving him there, letting the tension breathe. Instead, he approached not to elevate Frank, but to normalize him. That Frank would later realize was the real gesture. Dean spoke casually, as if they were continuing a conversation interrupted by time rather than hierarchy, and in doing so, removed the novelty that made others uneasy. Around them, men watched closely, understanding that normalization was power's most subtle weapon. They spoke of neutral things at first: music, travel, the absurdity of expectations, topics safe enough to reveal nothing and everything at once. Frank did not flatter Dean. Dean did not patronize Frank. The equality unsettled those listening in, men accustomed to seeing lines drawn clearly and defended aggressively. At one point, a third man joined them, someone whose approval was rarely sought and never given freely. He listened for a while before turning to Frank and asking, almost playfully, why a man in his position would choose silence when noise could have earned him more. Frank answered without hesitation, his voice calm, steady. "Noise attracts attention," he said. "Silence attracts decisions." The man laughed, but not dismissively. He laughed because the answer landed. By the end of the night, nothing had been agreed upon, nothing promised, nothing exchanged. And yet, as Frank left, he could feel the room recalibrating again. His time with him inside the equation rather than outside it. He had not bent. He had not boasted. He had not chased validation. And in a world where power fed on appetite, his lack of hunger was terrifying. Dean watched him go, recognizing the same pattern he had seen in himself years earlier. When he chose grace over domination and accepted the cost that came with it, later, alone. Dean returned to the small back lounge, where the leather bag had first appeared. It was no longer there. Not because someone had taken it, but because it had served its purpose. The absence felt deliberate, respectful. Dean understood then what Frank Lucas had truly offered: not money, not alliance, but a reminder that power could be exercised without cruelty, without noise, without spectacle. It was a reminder many men in that city needed, whether they admitted it or not. As the lights dimmed and the night folded into memory, Frank Lucas drove through the city's streets with the windows down, the air cool against his face. He had not gained territory or titles, but he had gained something far more volatile, a reputation built on restraint. And somewhere behind him, in rooms he would never enter again, men began to bow out with their heads, but with their calculations, adjusting their moves around a man who had proven that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be louder than any threat. By the time the third night arrived, the atmosphere surrounding Frank Lucas had changed from curiosity to pressure, the kind that pressed inward rather than down, seeking to discover where a man would bend if leaned on long enough. This was not accidental. In circles where influence mattered, restraint was respected only until it was proven durable, and durability was always tested publicly. Frank sensed it before the invitation came, felt it in the tone of conversations that stopped a beat too late, in the glances that lingered just long enough to ask an unspoken question. He understood the mechanics well. If he failed the test, the myth would collapse into rumor, and rumor would be consumed quickly. If he passed, he would become something harder to handle than force an example. The event itself was designed to look harmless. A charity gala draped in elegance and intention. The kind that allowed powerful men to appear generous without surrendering control. Frank arrived early again, not to be seen, but to observe the shape of the room before it filled. He noted where the light fell, how the seating angled power toward the center, how conversation clustered around certain figures as if pulled by gravity. This was not a place where threats would be spoken aloud. This was where reputations were tested through implication, where men were invited to reveal themselves by what they chose not to do. Frank took his place at a small table near the edge, visible but not central, content to let the evening come to him. When Frank Lucas noticed Dean Martin enter the room, he felt a quiet steadiness settle in his chest. Dean moved through the crowd with practiced ease, acknowledging greetings without collecting them, giving warmth without surrendering distance. Their eyes met briefly across the room, not as co-conspirators, not as allies, but as men who recognized the weight of being watched. Dean did not approach immediately. He understood the nature of the test unfolding and knew that timing mattered more than presence. Frank, for his part, did not seek him out. The absence of urgency was the point. As the evening progressed, the pressure revealed itself in subtler ways. A well-connected organizer approached Frank with a smile that never reached his eyes, complimenting his composure, remarking casually on the generosity of certain donors, then pausing as if inviting Frank to join the display. Frank listened patiently, nodding once, then responded with a measured politeness that offered neither refusal nor acceptance. He spoke about intention instead of amounts, about impact instead of recognition, gently redirecting the conversation away from performance. The organizer laughed, masking discomfort with charm, and moved on. Around the room, eyes tracked the exchange, recalibrating again. Later, a different kind of challenge emerged, one more personal, delivered through a remark that could be dismissed as humor if confronted directly. A man with a reputation for testing boundaries made a comment loud enough to be overheard, questioning whether silence was courage or concealment. The laughter that followed was thin, uncertain, waiting to see how Frank would respond. Frank did not look toward the speaker immediately. He finished his thought, set his glass down carefully, then turned with an expression neither offended nor amused. He addressed the room rather than the man, speaking calmly about how silence was often mistaken for emptiness by those who needed noise to feel present. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. The laughter died. The man smiled stiffly, having lost without being attacked. Dean watched from across the room, recognizing the precision of the response. Frank had not humiliated anyone. He had not escalated. He had simply reframed the moment, shifting the focus from ego to principle. That was the test. The room absorbed it slowly, like a lesson it had not expected to learn. When Dean finally approached, it was not to congratulate Frank, but to stand beside him, signaling to everyone watching that the moment had passed and the conclusion had been drawn. They spoke briefly, quietly, about nothing of consequence. And that was precisely what made it consequential. As the gala wound down, the conversations changed in texture. There was less probing, more listening. Men who had intended to test now sought to understand. Frank felt the shift and did not celebrate it. He knew better than to mistake acceptance for safety. Respect earned through restraint required constant renewal, and renewal demanded consistency. When he left, it was without announcement, without ceremony, the same way he had entered. The absence followed him like a shadow, heavier than presence. Dean remained behind a while longer, engaging in light conversation, answering questions that were really confessions in disguise. Later, alone, he reflected on the evening with the clarity that came from distance. He had seen many men rise quickly and fall just as fast, undone by the very attention they craved. Frank Lucas was different. He had passed the test not because he was unshakable, but because he understood where to place his weight. That understanding, Dean knew, would carry consequences far beyond any single room by the time the city settled into its late-night rhythm. The story had already begun to crystallize, not as gossip, but as guidance. Men spoke of the evening in terms of lessons, rather than outcomes. Of how composure could redirect power without confronting it. Frank drove through the quiet streets again, the glow of the city reflecting off the windshield, aware that the hardest part lay ahead. Passing the test was never the end. It was the beginning of expectation. An expectation, once formed, demanded a level of integrity that could not be performed, only lived. The final test did not arrive with an invitation or a warning, and that was how Frank Lucas knew it mattered. In worlds governed by influence, the most decisive moments rarely announced themselves. They appeared disguised as ordinary pressure, the kind that asked not what a man could gain, but what he was willing to lose. By now, Frank's presence had settled into the city's subconscious like a quiet law. Men adjusted their tone around him. Conversations slowed when he entered rooms. Not because he demanded it, but because uncertainty demanded caution. That uncertainty, however, could not be allowed to stand forever. Power structures hated ambiguity, and someone, eventually, would try to resolve it. It happened at a private gathering far removed from glamour, held in a place chosen specifically because it felt neutral, almost forgettable. No music, no stage, no audience to impress. Just men, decisions, and the unspoken understanding that something would be clarified before the night ended. Frank arrived alone, as he always did now, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp. He recognized most faces, knew the reputations behind them, understood exactly why each man had chosen to be there. This was not a confrontation. It was an assessment, and assessments, Frank had learned, were more dangerous than threats because they pretended to be reasonable. The conversation unfolded slowly, circling around cooperation, stability, and the value of alignment. The language was careful, polished, almost benevolent. Frank listened without interruption, allowing each speaker the dignity of being heard, even when their words were designed to corner him. When the offer finally emerged, it was framed as opportunity rather than demand, a chance to formalize influence, to step fully into visibility, to trade restraint for recognition. The implication was clear: accept, and the uncertainty would end. Decline, and the silence surrounding him would turn colder, sharper. Frank did not respond immediately. He looked around the room, meeting each gaze calmly, not challenging, not deferring, simply present. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unhurried, carrying none of the tension others felt. He said that alignment without principle was just convenience, and convenience had an expiration date. He spoke about restraint not as strategy, but as responsibility, explaining that power gained through pressure always demanded repayment, while power earned through consistency demanded only integrity. No one interrupted him, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the cost of arguing. Frank made it clear that he would not be owned by expectation, nor would he perform strength to satisfy insecurity. He declined the offer without rejecting the men, drawing a boundary so clean it left no room for insult. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat could have been. Some men shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned back, considering implications they had not anticipated. Frank felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. He had not won anything tangible, but he had closed a door many believed no one dared close. When he stood to leave, no one stopped him. No one needed to. The decision had already landed. Elsewhere that same night, Dean Martin sat alone in a quiet room, having already heard fragments of what was unfolding. News traveled quickly when it mattered, and Dean understood the significance before the details reached him. He thought back to his own defining moments, the times he had chosen grace over domination, knowing the cost would be whispered rather than announced. He recognized in Frank Lucas something deeper than discipline, a refusal to let the world decide the terms of his dignity. Dean knew then that Frank had crossed the threshold from respected presence to enduring figure. By the next morning, the city had absorbed the outcome in the only way it knew how: through behavior. Meetings were rescheduled. Assumptions were revised. Men who once tested now deferred, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. Frank Lucas had proven that restraint was not the absence of power, but its most refined form. No money had changed hands. No alliances had been declared. And yet, the balance had shifted permanently. Frank spent that morning driving without destination, letting the city pass him by. He felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. He understood now that the respect he had earned was not something he could spend, only something he could protect. That protection would require the same discipline that earned it in the first place. There would be no shortcuts, no dramatic gestures, no indulgence in the myth others were already building around him. He would remain consistent. Because consistency was the only thing myth could not exaggerate. That evening, Frank and Dean crossed paths once more, briefly, without ceremony. No speeches were made. No congratulations exchanged. Dean simply nodded, a small gesture loaded with understanding, and Frank returned it in kind. In that moment, nothing needed to be said. The story had completed itself not with domination, but with clarity. Men would speak of it later, of course, reshaping it into legend. But the truth would remain quieter and more enduring. In the end, what made others bow was never the money, nor the silence, nor even the courage to refuse. It was the consistency of a man who knew exactly who he was and refused to let the world negotiate that for him. In rooms built on force, he chose restraint. In moments designed to break him, he chose dignity. And that choice, repeated without compromise, came as legacy, one that could not be bought, borrowed, or taken, only recognized.